Robert had everything: wealth, power, and a woman who worshipped him. Leaving Isabelle for his young assistant felt like the right choice. Years later, his empire collapsed. Desperate for a job, he walked into an interview, only to freeze in shock. Sitting behind the CEO's desk was the last person he expected, his ex-wife. The city skyline shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Robert Stone's penthouse, reflecting the life he had built from the ground up. Everything in his world was polished, curated, and carefully structured to reflect success. His tailored suits, his luxury sports car, his prestigious office with a view that made his employees feel small. He had made it. Robert ran a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair, staring at his reflection in the glass. He liked what he saw: sharp jawline, piercing blue eyes that exuded confidence, a posture that demanded respect. He turned his gaze toward the dining table, where Isabelle sat, scrolling through her tablet, likely reviewing some report or organizing an event for his company, as she often did without him asking. She had always been the planner, the one who handled the logistics, the woman who worked tirelessly in the background to make sure his life ran smoothly. She was beautiful in a composed, understated way: warm brown eyes, soft waves of auburn hair, a quiet elegance about her. But she had never been the center of the room the way Robert was. She didn't command attention. She didn't thrive on the spotlight. And, though he never admitted it aloud, sometimes that bored him. Robert adjusted his cufflinks. "You're still working?" Isabelle looked up, the glow of the screen reflecting on her face. "Just finalizing some details for the upcoming gala. You know how important these events are for investor relations. I pay people for that," he replied, dismissively. She gave a small, knowing smile. "And yet, I always end up fixing things last minute." There was no hostility in her tone, just a quiet truth. Robert had once admired that about her. She was steady, reliable. She didn't demand attention or validation. But that, too, had begun to feel like a weight rather than an asset. The gala that night was at the kind of venue that whispered wealth in every carefully arranged detail. The clink of champagne flutes, the faint hum of an expensive jazz ensemble, the soft glow of chandeliers that cost more than most people's homes. Robert thrived in these settings. He knew exactly how to move through the crowd, how to command a conversation with a well-placed joke, a perfectly timed anecdote about his latest business win. It was there, among the sea of silk and diamonds, that he met Lena Thompson. She was young, ambitious, the kind of woman who knew exactly how to draw attention to herself. Her golden blonde hair framed a face that was all sharp angles and bright smiles, and when she laughed, it was the kind of laugh that made men turn their heads. She was bold, uninhibited, nothing like Isabelle, who moved through life with careful precision. Lena's hand brushed against Robert's arm as she whispered something amusing, her perfume intoxicatingly strong. He liked the way she made him feel, desired, exciting, as if he were a king and she was offering herself as the ultimate prize. Isabelle was across the room, engaged in quiet conversation with a senator's wife, unaware of the shift in her husband's attention. As the night went on, Lena became an irresistible temptation. She leaned in when she spoke, letting her fingers linger just a second longer than necessary, her gaze laced with something forbidden. She was offering more than a flirtation. She was a promise of something new, something unrestrained. Robert let it happen. What started as a thrilling, secret flirtation turned into something more. Late-night messages, secret meetings, a dangerous game where he convinced himself he wasn't doing anything wrong. He was a man of success, of power. Wasn't he entitled to take what he wanted? Isabelle noticed, of course. She wasn't a fool. She saw the way Robert's attention drifted, how he became more distracted, more impatient. She had spent years by his side, watching him maneuver deals, build his empire. She knew when something was off. And then, one evening, as he prepared for yet another business trip that was really a weekend away with Lena, she finally confronted him. "Robert," she said, standing in the doorway of their bedroom, arms crossed. "How long do you plan on pretending?" He barely glanced at her as he packed. "Pretending what?" "That this isn't happening." He paused, his hands stilling for a fraction of a second before he resumed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Isabelle let out a quiet breath, measured and calm, though he could see the hurt in her eyes. "You're a lot of things, Robert, but a liar has never been one of them." That annoyed him more than it should have. He threw a shirt into his suitcase with unnecessary force. Maybe you should stop assuming things, Isabelle. She studied him for a long moment. You don't love me anymore, do you? Robert didn't answer right away. He could have lied. He could have said what she wanted to hear, reassured her, played the part of a devoted husband. But something about her gaze, so steady and knowing, made the words feel useless. Finally, he exhaled. Not the way I used to. There it was. The truth. A sharp inhale. A slight flinch. But no outburst, no accusations. Just a nod, as if she had expected it. I see, she said quietly. Robert felt a flicker of discomfort. Why wasn't she fighting? Crying? Did she not care? But then, Isabelle had always been composed, even in moments of deep pain. She turned to leave, but before she did, she spoke one last time. You think you're making the right choice, Robert. I hope, one day, you won't regret it. And with that, she was gone. The divorce was swift. Robert made sure of it. He wanted it over, wanted to be free of the weight of his marriage so he could move forward with Lena. Isabelle didn't fight for more money, didn't try to drag things out. She walked away with little, just enough to start over, but nowhere near what she had contributed to his empire. As he watched her sign the final papers, a brief thought crossed his mind. Was she truly fine with this? Had she really accepted it so easily? But he didn't dwell on it, because he had already won. He had his success, his freedom, his new life with Lena. Everything was exactly how he wanted it to be. At least, that's what he believed. For now, what would you do if the person you betrayed ended up with all the power? Let me know in the comments. Would you walk away or fight for redemption? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Robert barely looked back once the papers were signed. The ink was still drying when he left the lawyer's office with a confidence that had never wavered before. He had done what was necessary, what was right for him. There was no use in dragging something out that had already run its course. Isabelle had been a part of his past, one that no longer fit into his future. Lena was waiting for him at the bar of an exclusive rooftop lounge, sipping on a cocktail, legs crossed elegantly, looking every bit the part of a woman who had won. She had won him, and Robert, in his mind, had won too. He leaned in to kiss her, inhaling the expensive scent of her perfume, letting his fingers trace down her bare shoulder. How does it feel? Lena asked, her lips curving into a smile as she tilted her head, watching him. How does what feel? Being free. Robert let out a slow breath, allowing himself to take in the city lights, the feeling of possibility stretching out before him. Like I should have done it sooner. Lena laughed, pleased with his answer, leaning into him with a kind of possessiveness he found thrilling. Isabelle, on the other hand, disappeared. She packed what little she took from the divorce and left their home without ceremony. Robert hadn't even bothered to check where she had gone. She didn't ask for the penthouse, didn't beg for a larger settlement, didn't even try to keep any ties to the company she had once been so involved in. She was just gone. For a moment, it unsettled him. He had expected some kind of fight, some resistance, but Isabelle had walked away without so much as a second glance. Had he meant so little to her? It was a fleeting thought, one he quickly shoved aside. He had better things to focus on. The months that followed were indulgent. Robert lived the life of a man untethered, traveling, splurging, hosting extravagant parties where Lena draped herself over him like a trophy. He threw money at anything and everything that reinforced his power. Lena thrived in that world, in the attention, in the sheer excess of it all. She was everything Isabelle hadn't been: bold, fiery, unpredictable. At first, it was exhilarating. Then, slowly, it became exhausting. Lena wasn't just high energy. She was relentless. She demanded, pushed, constantly needed more gifts, more luxury, more excitement. Where Isabelle had been content with quiet moments, Lena needed noise. Where Isabelle had supported him, Lena took from him. And yet, Robert told himself this was what he had wanted. He had traded stability for passion, and passion required a cost. But cracks began to show. At first, it was little things. Lena's impatience when he worked late. Her irritation when his attention wasn't solely on her. Then came the fights, fueled by alcohol and miscommunications, by jealousy and expectations. "You're obsessed with work, Robert," Lena snapped one evening, arms crossed as she glared at him from across their luxurious bedroom. "And you're obsessed with spending my money," he shot back, loosening his tie, already exhausted before the argument had truly begun. Lena's expression darkened. "Excuse me. You heard me. You knew who I was when we got together, Lena. I built this company from the ground up, and I'm not going to stop just because you think we should be vacationing every weekend." She scoffed. "You built it, but don't forget who's standing next to you now. You need me, Robert." That statement lingered, something about it unsettling him. Need her? No, he needed control. He needed his business, his empire, his sense of power. Lena was a part of the package, an exciting, beautiful part, but she was not the foundation. The tension between them only grew. But Robert ignored it, the same way he ignored the whispers in the industry that his leadership was slipping. Investors started raising concerns. Competitors began to sense blood in the water. Deals that once felt effortless now required more effort, more reassurance. And still, Robert refused to acknowledge it. But the people around him noticed. They saw the way his grip on everything was starting to weaken, the way he was more distracted, more reactive. Then came the real blow. "Robert, we need to talk." His CFO, a man who had stood by his side through years of expansion, sat across from him in his office, fingers laced together. There was something in his expression that made Robert uneasy, a cautiousness that he wasn't used to seeing. "Make it quick. I have. The company is in trouble." Robert scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous." "I'm not. We've been over-leveraging for months, covering losses with more acquisitions, stretching thin. The numbers don't lie. If we don't act now, we're fine." Robert cut him off. "We're not." The words landed heavier than he expected. Robert leaned back in his chair, forcing a smirk. "You think I don't know how to handle this? I've been running this company for over a decade. We always bounce back. Not this time." The certainty in his CFO's voice made something twist in Robert's stomach. But he still refused to believe it. Not long after, Lena began to distance herself. She still enjoyed the wealth, the parties, the influence, but she could sense the shift. Robert was no longer the man at the top of the food chain, no longer untouchable. One evening, after yet another argument over expenses, Robert found himself alone in the penthouse, staring at the city beyond the windows. The same city that had once felt like it was his playground now felt like a threat, an entity waiting for his inevitable fall. He had done everything right, hadn't he? He had chosen himself, his happiness. He had gotten rid of the wife who had held him back, had surrounded himself with luxury, with excitement. So why did he feel like he was standing on the edge of a cliff? It was around that time that he heard whispers about Isabelle. "She's doing well," someone had mentioned at a networking event. Robert had nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Isabelle, the woman who had walked away with almost nothing, doing well? She started her own thing, I think. Small company, but growing. Some solid investments backing her. It was a fleeting conversation, one he had dismissed easily at the time. Isabelle wasn't his concern. She was a relic of his past, and his focus was on salvaging what was left of his future. But as the weeks passed, as his company edged closer and closer to collapse, as Lena became colder, as his name lost the weight it once carried, Robert found himself thinking about Isabelle more often. Where had she gone? Had she really started something new? And why, despite everything, did the thought of her thriving without him feel like a greater betrayal than any other loss? He shook the thought from his mind. He had chosen his path, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. Robert Stone had always believed that the world was his for the taking. He was a man of results, a force that turned obstacles into stepping stones, a leader who dictated the terms of success. There had never been a deal he couldn't close, a challenge he couldn't crush, a problem he couldn't outmaneuver. Failure wasn't something he feared, because failure was something that happened to other people, to the weak, to the unprepared, never to him. That was why, when the first cracks in his empire began to appear, Robert dismissed them without hesitation. Market shifts were natural. Investments fluctuated. Companies expanded and contracted. It was all part of the game. He had seen it happen before. He had weathered worse storms. This wasn't any different. But this time, it was different. It started with whispers. Subtle, quiet concerns in board meetings, numbers that didn't quite align, investors who hesitated when once they had jumped at the chance to back him. Robert ignored them. He had built his fortune through calculated risks, through pushing past doubt. Fear was what held people back, and he had never let it control him. Then the first deal collapsed. A merger he had spent months negotiating suddenly fell apart at the final moment. The other company pulled out, citing concerns about long-term sustainability. The phrase irritated him. It was nonsense, corporate jargon for executives too scared to take real chances. Then came the second loss. A key investor withdrew funding, suddenly and without warning, taking a significant chunk of capital with them. Robert still didn't panic. He tightened his operations, adjusted projections, told himself it was just a momentary setback. But then, the stock price began to slide. The media caught wind of it. Journalists, once eager to sing his praises, started questioning his leadership. "Is Robert Stone's empire in trouble?" one headline read. "The King of Wall Street facing uncertain future," said another. He scoffed at them. The media loved to build people up just to tear them down. It was all noise, nothing more. Then, one afternoon, his CFO walked into his office, a stack of reports in his hands and a look in his eyes that Robert didn't like. "We have a problem," he said. "We've had problems before," Robert replied, leaning back in his chair, unbothered. "We'll solve this one too." The CFO exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Not like this. Robert, we're bleeding money. Fast. The company is over-leveraged. The debts we took on to expand, we knew there'd be short-term risks. That was the strategy. It's not short-term anymore. The numbers don't lie. We're running out of time." Robert's jaw tightened. He had been hearing this too much lately. He didn't like the way his executives were starting to sound. Nervous, uncertain, questioning him as if he hadn't led them through crisis after crisis before. "Then we do what we've always done. We push through. It's not that simple. We're at the point where banks are hesitating to lend us more. If we don't make some drastic cuts, we could," I said. "We'll handle it," Robert snapped, cutting him off. The CFO stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once, slowly, before leaving the room. Robert turned his chair toward the window, gazing down at the city. He refused to believe he was losing control. But deep down, for the first time in his life, something cold and unfamiliar settled in his gut. Doubt. At home, Lena could sense the tension, but she had little patience for it. At first, she played the role of the supportive girlfriend, offering comforting words and distracting him in the ways she knew best: lavish nights out, expensive trips, carefully staged photos to remind the world they were still the perfect power couple. But when the strain of his collapsing empire began to seep into their daily life, her patience wore thin. "You're working too much," she complained one evening, sitting across from him at the dinner table, arms crossed. Robert barely looked up from his phone. "I'm fixing things. All you do is work. You're always stressed. When was the last time we actually enjoyed ourselves?" He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Lena, this is temporary. Once things settle, that's what you always say? Maybe I don't want to wait." His eyes flicked up to hers, something sharp in his expression. "And what exactly are you saying?" She leaned back, folding her arms, the irritation in her posture unmistakable. "I didn't sign up to watch everything fall apart. If this is what life with you is going to be like, maybe it's not what I want." The words sent a slow, burning anger through him. He set his phone down, meeting her gaze. "So that's it. The moment things get hard, you're looking for an exit?" Lena didn't flinch. "I'm not like you, Robert. I don't live for this. I like nice things. I like stability. And if you can't give me that anymore." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Robert exhaled, shaking his head. "You're unbelievable." She shrugged, unfazed. "You'll figure it out. You always do." But there was something in her tone, something indifferent, almost dismissive, that stuck with him long after she had left the table. 2 weeks later, she was gone. No big scene. No dramatic goodbye. She simply packed her bags, left the penthouse, and didn't look back. Robert barely reacted. If he had learned anything from his rise to the top, it was that people were temporary. Their loyalty lasted only as long as their benefits. He had once thought Isabelle was the exception, but even she had left. Now Lena had done the same. It didn't matter. None of it mattered. Because his focus was on one thing and one thing only: saving what was left of his company. But it was too late. The board had been having secret meetings for weeks, discussing contingency plans and alternative leadership. Investors had lost confidence. More funding opportunities closed. And then, one morning, Robert walked into the office to find his CFO and several board members waiting for him, their expressions grave. They had made their decision. Effective immediately, He was being removed as CEO. Security escorted him out of the building he had built from the ground up. Employees whispered, avoiding his gaze. The world he had controlled for so long was slipping from his grasp, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. That night, he sat in his penthouse, silent, empty, the city stretching out below him like a kingdom he no longer ruled. He had always believed he was invincible. But now, for the first time in his life, Robert Stone had to face a truth he never thought possible. He had lost, and no one was coming to save him. Robert woke up to silence. No messages, no calls, no emails from investors demanding meetings, no urgent notifications about billion-dollar deals waiting for his approval. Just silence, a kind that pressed into the walls of his penthouse, filling every corner with an emptiness he wasn't used to. For the first time in years, his time was his own. No agenda, no responsibilities, no empire to manage. He was free, and he hated it. He sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, hands clasped. He had gone to sleep drunk and still woke up with a headache that had nothing to do with alcohol. His mind kept replaying the moment he had been escorted out of his own company, the glances from employees who once scrambled to please him, the hushed conversations as security walked him to the elevator, the way the receptionist who used to greet him with a bright, eager smile now wouldn't meet his eyes. The shame settled in his stomach like a stone. He stood, making his way to the bathroom, turning on the sink and splashing cold water on his face. He looked up at the mirror and barely recognized himself. His sharp blue eyes, once filled with unshakable confidence, now looked hollow. His jaw was tense, his usually impeccable hair slightly disheveled. He wasn't a man at the top of the world anymore. He was just another casualty of his own arrogance. The board had made sure of that. They had waited until he was vulnerable, had prepared behind his back, built their case so perfectly that by the time they told him he was being removed as CEO, there was nothing he could do. It was a clean, precise execution, the kind he might have admired if it hadn't been aimed at him. The official statement released to the press painted it as a necessary transition for the long-term stability of the company. No scandal, no drama, just a quiet, calculated erasure of Robert Stone from the empire he had built. He had always believed power was something no one could take from him. He had been wrong. By noon, he was sitting in his home office, staring at his phone, forcing himself to act. He still had connections. He could find a way back in. He called people he had once considered allies, other CEOs, former investors, industry leaders who had praised his business instincts. Every call went the same way. "Robert, it's just a tough situation right now. I need to be careful with my own investments. Your company's in a rough spot, and I can't take that risk. I wish I could help, man, but my hands are tied." They weren't tied. They just didn't want to associate with a sinking ship. By the end of the day, it was clear. No one was coming to his rescue. The realization made him sick. It had always been him and him alone. He had clawed his way to the top with ruthless efficiency, made decisions based on numbers rather than people, ensured that no one held power over him. He had been admired, feared, respected, but never loved, never trusted. And now, when he needed someone to believe in him the way people once had, there was no one left. That night, he sat on the couch, drinking straight from the bottle, watching the city lights flicker outside the window. He remembered when this view had made him feel invincible, when he used to stand in front of these windows and feel like the city belonged to him. Now, it felt like he was on the outside looking in. A notification buzzed on his phone. He glanced down, expecting more bad news. It was a financial news article. More Enterprises announces expansion, poised to acquire major assets from Stone Industries' recent liquidation. Robert stared at the words, the letters blurring slightly as his mind processed what he was seeing. More Enterprises. Isabelle. For the first time in months, he felt something other than shame or anger. He felt cold. He had barely thought about her since the divorce. Not because she wasn't worth thinking about, but because he had never imagined she would matter again. He had assumed she would disappear into obscurity, maybe remarry someone safe and dull, someone who would give her a quiet, predictable life. He had never considered the possibility that she would build something of her own. And now, she wasn't just succeeding. She was thriving. While he was losing everything, she was acquiring the pieces he had left behind. Robert closed the article, rubbing his jaw, his mind racing. Had this been her plan all along? Had she known he would fall? He tried to convince himself that it was just coincidence, that she had simply made the right moves at the right time. But something in the back of his mind told him otherwise. Isabelle was calculated, strategic. She had always been more patient than him, more willing to play the long game. He reached for his phone again, opening up a search bar. Isabelle, more CEO, more enterprises, dozens of results appeared. He clicked on one of the most recent articles. There she was, pictured at some business summit, standing behind a sleek, modern podium, addressing a room full of industry leaders. She looked different, stronger, sharper. The warmth she had once carried so effortlessly was still there, but it was refined, controlled. She wasn't just playing the part of a powerful woman. She was one. Robert felt something tighten in his chest. He had spent years seeing Isabelle as the woman behind him, the quiet force that made his life easier but never stepped into the spotlight. He had dismissed her the moment he found something more exciting, more thrilling. And yet, here she was, not just surviving, thriving. He couldn't ignore it. The next morning, he got out of bed with a determination he hadn't felt in weeks. He needed to see it for himself. He arrived at Moore Enterprises headquarters just before noon, stepping into the building like a man who still had power, still had influence. He walked to the reception desk, ignoring the curious glances from the staff. "I have a meeting with Isabelle Moore," he said, his voice steady. The receptionist blinked, surprised. "Do you have an appointment?" Robert smiled, the kind of confident smile that once got him anything he wanted. "Tell her it's Robert." The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone. Robert stood there, hands in his pockets, waiting. Then she looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Mr. Stone. Ms. Moore isn't available." Robert's smile faltered slightly. "Then schedule something for next week." "She isn't available for future appointments, either." There was something about the way she said it that made it clear. Isabelle didn't just refuse to see him today. She refused to see him, period. Robert clenched his jaw, nodding once before turning on his heel and walking out of the building. For the first time in his life, he had been dismissed, shut out, forgotten. And he realized something as he stepped onto the street, the cold wind biting at his skin. Isabelle wasn't just another business rival. She was the one holding all the power now. And that terrified him. Robert Stone had never felt small. Not when he was a young, hungry entrepreneur fighting for his first deal. Not when he outmaneuvered competitors twice his age. Not even when he walked out on Isabelle and chose Lena, convinced that his life was only going to get better. He had always been the one towering over others, dictating the terms, watching people scramble to impress him. He had been feared, admired, envied. But now, as he walked aimlessly through the city, the weight of his downfall pressing down on him, he felt something unfamiliar. He felt invisible. The power he had once wielded was gone. His money, his reputation, his influence, everything that made him Robert Stone had been stripped away. The people who used to return his calls in minutes now ignored him. His so-called friends, the ones who had laughed at his jokes and clung to his success, had vanished the moment he was no longer someone worth knowing. And Lena? He hadn't heard from her since she left, not that he expected to. She had gotten what she wanted from him and moved on to her next prize. For days, he drifted. He woke up late, sat in his penthouse staring at the walls, tried to ignore the emptiness swallowing him whole. He told himself he wasn't done, that he would figure something out, that this was just a temporary setback. But the reality was brutal. He wasn't just out of a job, he was out of options. His bank accounts were bleeding. His assets were frozen or tangled up in legal disputes. The lavish lifestyle he had built was unsustainable without the income that once poured in effortlessly. The penthouse, the cars, the luxury. He couldn't hold on to it all. And the worst part? The world didn't care. There was no sympathy for fallen kings. The headlines that once celebrated him had moved on to the next rising star. His name had become a cautionary tale, a lesson in arrogance and overreach. One morning, as he scrolled through the news, his stomach twisted at what he saw. Moore Enterprises announces landmark acquisition, expanding influence in key financial sectors. Another victory for Isabelle. Another reminder of how far she had come while he was falling apart. The bitterness was immediate. It wasn't enough that she had rebuilt her own life. She had done it in a way that overshadowed his ruin. She had moved into his industry, taken pieces of what he had lost, and used them to make herself stronger. It should have made him furious. It should have ignited the fire that had always driven him forward. But instead, it made him tired. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his face. He needed a job. Not a return to his former glory, not yet, but something. Something that would keep him afloat, allow him to survive long enough to figure out his next move. He swallowed his pride and started making calls. It was worse than he expected. Every firm he contacted rejected him. Some were polite, offering vague excuses about not having the right role or concerns from investors. Others were blunt. His name was a liability, his reputation too damaged to risk associating with. And then, a recruiter reached out. A firm was looking for an executive consultant, someone with experience in high-level negotiations, corporate restructuring. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. He agreed to an interview. The day of the meeting, he dressed carefully. His suit was still expensive, his posture still straight, but there was something different about him now. A weight he hadn't carried before. He arrived at the building 15 minutes early, a habit drilled into him from years of living in boardrooms. He took the elevator up, rehearsing his answers, reminding himself of the man he used to be. He was still Robert Stone. He could still command a room, still close a deal. Then the door to the conference room opened, and his breath caught in his throat. Sitting at the head of the table, reviewing a file with quiet intensity, was Isabelle. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it, that his mind, wrecked by months of humiliation, was playing tricks on him. But then she looked up, and he knew. She wasn't just running the company that had posted the job. She was the one who had orchestrated this entire meeting. His stomach twisted as she leaned back in her chair, crossing her legs, assessing him with that same composed expression she had worn when she signed their divorce papers. "Robert." Her voice was steady, professional. "Please, have a seat." He moved on autopilot, lowering himself into the chair across from her. His mind raced. Had she done this on purpose? Was this a test? A way to humiliate him further? "I wasn't expecting you," he said, his voice controlled but tense. "No," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "I imagine you weren't." He had been in countless high-stakes negotiations, faced some of the most powerful people in the industry, but sitting across from Isabelle in this moment felt more dangerous than anything he had ever encountered. She closed the file in front of her, folding her hands over it. "Let's be clear about something before we begin." Her brown eyes locked onto his. "This isn't charity. I don't believe in charity." Robert swallowed. "Then why am I here?" "Because I'm in the business of making smart investments," she said. "And you, Robert, despite everything, still have value." The words stung more than they should have. She didn't say he was brilliant. She didn't say he was the best. She said he had value, like an asset she could use, not a person she respected. She had once been his wife. Now she was speaking to him like she was his superior. Because she was. Isabelle let the silence stretch between them before continuing. "You're in no position to negotiate. You need this job. And I need someone who understands high-risk business restructuring." Robert's jaw tightened. "So what? You're offering me a lifeline." "I'm offering you an opportunity," she corrected. "But let's not pretend this is anything more than that." He hated the way she looked at him. Calm, unreadable, as if she had already won before he even had a chance to speak. He should have walked out. Should have told her he didn't need her, that he would find another way. But there was no other way. And she knew it. Robert exhaled slowly. "What's the role?" She slid a contract across the table. He picked it up, scanning it quickly. The title was meaningless, an executive position with no real power, no influence. The salary was good, but nowhere near what he used to command. It was a job, a real job, one that forced him to answer to her. His pride screamed at him to push the paper away, to get up and leave. But the reality was staring him in the face. If he didn't take this, he had nothing. He set the contract down, meeting her gaze. "And if I say yes?" She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then we'll see just how much you've really changed." Robert stared at the contract for a long moment, the words blurring together as his mind fought against the reality of the situation. The offer was clear, structured, impersonal, devoid of any sentimentality. He had spent his life dictating terms, rewriting agreements to his advantage, shaping deals until they bent to his will. But this was different. This time, he wasn't in control. Isabelle was. He looked up at her, searching for any sign of hesitation, but she remained as unreadable as ever. There was no triumph in her expression, no smugness. If anything, she seemed entirely detached, as if hiring him was nothing more than a calculated decision, a move on a chessboard where she already knew the outcome. Robert inhaled slowly, straightening his posture. Why me? Isabelle didn't flinch. You still have experience that's difficult to replace. For all your mistakes, you know this industry inside and out. If I wanted someone with a clean record, I could find a dozen other candidates. But I need someone who understands failure. The words landed heavier than he expected. He had always prided himself on his instincts, on his ability to adapt and thrive where others collapsed under pressure. But hearing Isabelle say it so plainly, that he was valuable because he had failed, left a bitter taste in his mouth. You think I'm desperate enough to take this? His voice was measured, but they both knew the answer. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the polished table. You wouldn't be sitting here if you weren't. He wanted to argue, to push back, to reclaim some fragment of the authority he had lost, but the truth was undeniable. He was desperate. His options were non-existent, his resources dwindling by the day. This job, this humiliating, unthinkable opportunity, was the only real chance he had to rebuild. His fingers curled around the edges of the contract. He could feel the weight of it, the unspoken power dynamics woven between the lines of legal jargon. Accepting this meant swallowing his pride, admitting that he had lost, placing himself in the hands of the one person he had once discarded without a second thought. He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to meet her gaze. What are the conditions? She tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether she even needed to humor the question. Then, she gestured toward the contract. It's all there. A 6-month probation period. A structured role with no executive decision-making until you prove you can be trusted. A strict non-compete clause. If you quit or get fired, you won't be able to work in this industry for the next 2 years. And Robert's grip on the paper tightened. That's a long leash. She raised an eyebrow. It's not a leash, Robert. It's a test. The words stung more than they should have. He had spent years commanding rooms full of men who trembled at the sound of his name. And now, here he was, being told he needed to prove himself. His pride burned. But so did the reality of his situation. Isabelle folded her hands over the table, waiting. She wasn't rushing him, wasn't pressing him for an answer. She didn't need to. She already knew what he was going to do, and that infuriated him. But it also left him with only one option. He reached for the pen, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his bones. The ink flowed effortlessly as he signed his name at the bottom of the page, sealing his fate with a few simple strokes. When he set the pen down, Isabelle took the contract, scanning it briefly before nodding. Welcome to More Enterprises, she said, her tone as neutral as if she were hiring a stranger. Robert forced himself to hold her gaze. I assume you expect me to start immediately. Her expression didn't change. I expect you to follow the rules. The words carried an unspoken warning, one that sent a sharp current of irritation through him. He had spent his career bending rules, reshaping them to suit his needs. Now, he was the one being placed under scrutiny, the one being managed. Isabelle rose from her seat, collecting the file and tucking it under her arm. You'll report to HR tomorrow morning for orientation. They'll brief you on your responsibilities. Robert narrowed his eyes. Not you. She gave him a small, knowing smile. I don't have time to micromanage employees. The dismissal stung more than he cared to admit. He clenched his jaw, pushing himself up from the chair, adjusting his suit as if the fabric itself had tightened around him. He wasn't used to feeling like an employee, to standing across from someone who had once been his wife and now treated him as little more than an acquisition. But there was nothing he could do. Not yet. As he walked out of the conference room, the reality of what he had just done settled over him like a suffocating weight. He had signed away his freedom, tethered himself to a job that put him directly beneath Isabelle's authority. And somehow, despite everything, she still wasn't done making him pay. The next morning, Robert arrived at the More Enterprises headquarters, stepping into a building that now represented something he had never imagined, his second chance. The front desk receptionist glanced up as he approached, her eyes widening slightly in recognition. He saw it in her face before she spoke, the realization of who he was, of what he had once been. I have a meeting with HR, he said, his voice steady. She nodded, recovering quickly, but he caught the flicker of amusement in her expression. Once, people had scrambled to accommodate him. Now, they barely concealed their curiosity at seeing him in this position. An assistant led him down a sleek hallway lined with glass offices, where employees worked diligently, unaware of the man who had once ruled the industry walking among them as just another name on the payroll. Robert squared his shoulders, forcing himself to ignore the stares, the subtle whispers. He wasn't here to dwell on the past. He was here to survive. The HR director, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an air of efficiency, barely glanced up as he entered her office. "Mr. Stone, have a seat." He did. She slid a stack of paperwork across the desk. "Your onboarding documents. Read them carefully. Your schedule is in the packet, along with your assigned projects." Robert flipped through the pages, catching words like performance evaluation, compliance training, team integration. The implication was clear. He was being monitored closely. He forced himself to keep his expression neutral. "I assume Isabelle will be overseeing my progress." The HR director arched an eyebrow. "Ms. Moore doesn't involve herself in day-to-day management. You'll be reporting to a department lead." Robert frowned. That was unexpected. He had assumed Isabelle would keep a closer eye on him, would want to personally watch him struggle. But no, she had put him in the system like any other hire, placed him in a role designed to test his patience, then walked away. And somehow, that was worse. It meant she didn't see him as a threat. It meant she didn't care. As he signed the final document, sealing his place at Moore Enterprises, Robert realized something unsettling. For the first time in his life, he wasn't playing the game. He was just another piece on the board. And Isabelle was the one making the moves. Robert had always believed he understood power. He had spent years perfecting the art of control, learning how to bend people's will, how to manipulate situations in his favor. But sitting at his new desk, one that wasn't in a corner office, one that wasn't made of expensive mahogany imported from Europe, he realized power wasn't about who talked the loudest, who made the most money, or who had the largest office. Real power was something quieter, something strategic, something Isabelle had mastered. He had expected her to gloat, to take satisfaction in his humiliation, to remind him of the choices that had led him here. But she had done none of that. Instead, she had placed him in a position where he was neither important nor invisible, where he was just significant enough to matter, but not enough to influence. It was deliberate. She wanted him to feel the weight of his insignificance. And it was working. He had spent the first week learning the new systems, adjusting to the workflow, forcing himself to adapt to a position that would have been beneath him not long ago. The meetings were different. He wasn't the one leading them anymore. He was expected to listen, take notes, report to people he would have once dismissed without a second thought. There were no assistants waiting to cater to his needs, no employees vying for his attention. For the first time in years, he was on the other side of the equation. And it was suffocating. His coworkers knew who he was. Of course, they did. The whispers were impossible to ignore. Some were subtle, a raised eyebrow when he walked past, a smirk exchanged between two junior executives when he was assigned a project. Others weren't so discreet. Conversations cut off when he entered a room. Stolen glances during meetings. A few bold enough to make casual remarks about the great Robert Stone sitting in a shared office space. Robert clenched his jaw, forced himself to endure it. This was temporary. He wasn't going to let them get to him. But then there was Isabelle. She never acknowledged him. Never looked in his direction when she passed by. Never so much as hinted that she was aware of his presence in the company she now controlled. And somehow, that was the worst part of all. She was busy, of course. Her schedule was packed with meetings, business trips, interviews with the press. Every morning, as he read through the company emails, her name was there, leading acquisitions, securing deals, expanding the empire that she had built from the ground up. And the more he read, the more he realized something he had never truly considered before. Isabelle hadn't just survived without him. She had thrived. Her leadership style was different from his, but it was working. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't interested in rapid, aggressive expansion the way he had been. She was precise, calculated. Every move she made was deliberate, every acquisition well planned. She played the long game, and she was winning. Robert had spent years believing she had been nothing more than an extension of him, a steady presence that made his life easier, someone who had supported his dreams without having any of her own. But he had been wrong. Isabelle had always been capable of this. She had always had the intelligence, the vision, the strategy. The only difference was that now, without him holding her back, she had been given the space to prove it. And she was proving it. over and over again. One evening, long after most employees had left the office, Robert found himself standing outside her office door. It was slightly ajar, the soft glow of her desk lamp casting shadows on the hallway floor. He hesitated for a moment, then knocked once before pushing the door open. Isabelle didn't look up right away. She was reviewing a contract, her expression focused. When she finally acknowledged his presence, it was with a calm, unreadable gaze. "Robert." Her voice was steady, controlled. "Something you need?" For a second, he considered lying, making up an excuse for why he was there. But something in her posture, the way she barely gave him her attention, made him drop the pretense. "You've built something impressive," he admitted, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "I didn't expect that." She raised an eyebrow, setting down her pen. "Didn't expect what?" "That I'd be successful without you." The word stung, but he forced himself not to react. "That you'd take over the industry the way you have." She leaned back in her chair, studying him. People underestimate what's possible when they stop wasting time proving themselves to the wrong person. Robert exhaled slowly, nodding. "I deserve that." Isabelle tilted her head slightly, as if deciding whether she agreed. "You deserve a lot of things, Robert. I'm not interested in listing them." Her words weren't cruel. They weren't even angry. They were just factual. For the first time, Robert felt something other than humiliation in her presence. He felt regret. He cleared his throat. "Do you ever think about it?" She didn't need to ask what it was. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then, she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "I think about what I learned," she said finally. "I think about how much I sacrificed for someone who didn't see me. I think about how much stronger I had to become because of that. And I think about how, in the end, I was the one who walked away with the better deal." Robert swallowed hard. "Is that what this is? A way to get even?" She smiled, but there was no malice in it. Just certainty. "Robert, if I wanted revenge, you wouldn't be sitting here right now." He stared at her, feeling something shift inside him. Isabelle wasn't here to destroy him. She had already moved past that. She had built something better, something stronger, and he wasn't a part of it. That realization hit harder than any loss he had suffered before. He had been so focused on climbing back to the top that he hadn't stopped to consider the truth. He wasn't the main character in this story anymore. Isabelle was. And for the first time in his life, Robert Stone didn't know what to do next. Robert sat in the dimly lit break room, gripping a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The chatter of employees passing by barely registered in his mind. He had once been the kind of man who commanded attention the moment he walked into a room, the kind of man people whispered about with admiration or envy. Now, he was nothing more than another face in the crowd, a cautionary tale in a company run by the very woman he had underestimated. The weight of his new reality pressed down on him. Isabelle was his boss. That fact alone was difficult enough to swallow, but it was the way she handled it that unnerved him the most. She didn't gloat. She didn't remind him of his failures. She didn't even acknowledge his presence unless absolutely necessary. And somehow, that was worse than outright humiliation. If she had flaunted her success in his face, if she had made it clear that she was reveling in his downfall, at least it would have meant she cared enough to want revenge. But this was indifference. Indifference from Isabelle Moore was the most cutting punishment of all. Robert clenched his jaw, staring down at the black surface of his coffee. He was tired of feeling like this. Tired of feeling powerless, of being just another name on the payroll. He had spent years shaping industries, dictating the future of companies with the flick of a pen, bending markets to his will. He wasn't built to take orders. He wasn't built to be overlooked. And yet, Isabelle had managed to place him in exactly that position. Every meeting he attended, he was forced to listen rather than lead. Every project assigned to him was carefully curated, not meaningless, but never important enough to truly influence company direction. It was calculated, deliberate. Isabelle had put him in a position where he was useful but never crucial, where he could prove his worth without ever regaining power. The worst part? He couldn't complain. There was no mistreatment, no unfair treatment to latch onto. Nothing to justify an outburst that would make him feel like he had some level of control. Everything she did was precise, professional, undeniably reasonable. And it was infuriating. That afternoon, as he walked toward the conference room for another meeting where he would be expected to sit quietly while others took the lead, he caught sight of Isabelle down the hallway. She was speaking with a group of executives, her posture relaxed yet commanding, her voice carrying just enough authority to draw people in without demanding it. She had always been good at that, controlling a room without making it obvious she was doing so. Robert used to admire that about her. Now, he hated that he was on the outside looking in. As if sensing his gaze, Isabelle's eyes flicked toward him for the briefest moment. Then, just as quickly, she looked away, continuing her conversation as if he weren't even there. Robert gritted his teeth and kept walking. The meeting was a financial review of the company's upcoming acquisitions, an area he once excelled in. He knew every strategy, every loophole, every way to maximize profit while minimizing risk. But now, instead of leading the discussion, he was an observer, his input requested only when necessary. Halfway through, one of the junior executives, a man barely in his 30s, directed a question at him. "Robert, given your experience, what's your take on the risk factor for this merger?" It was the first time in weeks someone had directly sought out his opinion. The room quieted slightly as eyes turned toward him. Isabelle remained composed at the head of the table, waiting. Robert straightened, his mind working quickly. "The risk isn't in the numbers," he said, his voice steady. "It's in the optics. The market is still watching to see if more enterprises can maintain momentum. If this acquisition is framed as a desperate grab for expansion rather than a strategic move, investors will hesitate." A pause. Then, the executive nodded. "That's a fair point." For the first time in a long while, Robert felt a flicker of something familiar. Influence. Relevance. But just as quickly, Isabelle spoke. "The market perception is always a factor," she said, her tone smooth, unwavering. "Which is why we've already accounted for that in the communication strategy. The press release will emphasize the long-term synergy, not just short-term growth." It was a subtle maneuver, but Robert caught it immediately. She had taken his input, acknowledged it, but immediately reaffirmed that she was a step ahead, that she had already anticipated what he was pointing out. And just like that, whatever influence he had gained in that moment vanished. The meeting continued. Robert remained silent, stewing in his own frustration. Later that evening, as he left the office, he found himself standing outside Isabelle's door. The light was still on. She was still working. For a moment, he debated whether to knock, whether to confront her, whether to ask her outright what her endgame was. Then, without giving himself a chance to hesitate, he opened the door and stepped inside. Isabelle looked up from her desk, unsurprised. "Something on your mind?" Robert closed the door behind him. "What are you doing?" She leaned back in her chair, regarding him with a calm expression. "Running a company. What are you doing?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Cut the act, Isabelle. You're keeping me in a box. You give me just enough responsibility to be useful, but never enough to be relevant." A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Amusement, maybe, or quiet satisfaction. And Robert stepped closer, resting his hands on the back of one of the chairs in front of her desk. "Why?" She studied him for a long moment before finally answering. "Because you need to learn what it feels like." He stiffened. "What?" "To be overlooked," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "To be underestimated. To be dismissed." Robert's fingers curled against the chair. "I spent years in your shadow, Robert. Supporting you. Making things run smoothly so you could take all the credit. I never complained. Never asked for recognition. And you never noticed." His chest tightened. "Is this about revenge?" She tilted her head slightly. "No. If it were about revenge, I wouldn't have hired you." Robert swallowed hard, searching for something to say. Isabelle continued, her voice calm. "This isn't about punishing you. It's about forcing you to see something you never saw before. You built an empire believing you were the only one who mattered. Now, you get to experience what it's like to be just another piece in the machine." He hated how rational she sounded, how in control she remained. He exhaled, stepping back. "So what? I just accept this." She smiled faintly. "That's up to you." Robert turned, leaving her office without another word. As he walked down the hallway, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about a job anymore. This was about proving her wrong. Robert arrived at the office earlier than usual, stepping into the quiet of the nearly empty building. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, the polished floors reflecting the cold glow of the corporate world he now existed in. Not as its leader, not as the man at the top, but as someone trying to claw his way back into relevance. The weight of his conversation with Isabelle lingered in his mind, her words echoing in a way he couldn't shake. This isn't about punishing you. It's about forcing you to see something you never saw before. He had spent years treating people like tools, seeing them only for what they could offer him. Now, he was the tool, placed neatly into a role that kept him useful but not powerful. It was calculated, deliberate, and worst of all, it was working. He had been at more enterprises for weeks now, and every day was a reminder of just how far he had fallen. The whispers in the office had died down, but the underlying sentiment remained. People were watching him, waiting to see if he would break, if he would lash out, if he would walk away with his pride still intact. He could feel it in the way they spoke to him, in the careful way his superiors framed their instructions, as if expecting resistance. But Robert wasn't giving them the satisfaction. Not yet. Today, his assignment was another strategic review, analyzing a set of potential partnerships and outlining risks and benefits. A task that would have once been assigned to his junior staff, now placed on his desk like a test. He opened the files, flipping through financial statements, market analyses, projections. Then he saw a name that made his breath hitch. Thompson and Company. It took him a second to process it. The name was familiar, too familiar. His mind raced, pulling up memories he had pushed aside. Lena, her father's firm. A slow, bitter smirk formed on his lips. Of course, Thompson and Company had always been a smaller player in the financial world, never quite breaking into the top-tier elite firms. When Robert was at the height of his power, he had barely given them a second thought. And now, they were here, listed among the potential partners more enterprises was considering for expansion. Robert exhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. It didn't matter. He wasn't here to dwell on the past. He had a job to do. He reviewed the numbers, analyzing their growth, their stability. The firm had improved significantly since he last looked at them. It was clear that they had positioned themselves well in the shifting market, making smart, calculated moves. But there were weaknesses, holes in their foundation that he recognized immediately. They weren't as strong as they appeared. He gathered his notes and prepared his report. By the time the office was fully awake with employees filtering in and meetings beginning, Robert was ready. The weekly strategy meeting was led by Isabelle herself, a room full of executives discussing upcoming partnerships and risks. Robert took his seat among them, forcing himself to appear composed, unreadable. One of the senior executives spoke first. Thompson and Company has shown promising growth over the past few quarters. Their valuation has nearly doubled, and their investment strategies are aligning well with our goals. Robert leaned back slightly, listening. Another executive nodded. They've stabilized since the market shift last year. Their expansion into commercial lending has been aggressive but well managed. Isabelle glanced at Robert, the first real acknowledgement she had given him in days. Thoughts? He kept his expression neutral. On paper, they look strong, but their expansion has left them vulnerable. Their recent acquisitions were funded largely through leveraged debt. If the market wobbles, even slightly, they'll be overextended. A few heads turned toward him, considering his words. One of the executives frowned. Their reports don't indicate. They wouldn't, Robert cut in. Their numbers are clean, but they're built on optimism. I know the strategy well because I used it myself. It works until it doesn't. A long silence settled over the room. Isabelle studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a moment, she nodded. That's a risk worth noting. The conversation shifted, but Robert could feel it. The first ripple. The first moment where he had added value, where his words carried weight. It wasn't redemption. Not yet. But it was something. Later that evening, as he packed up his things to leave, he heard a voice behind him. You were right about Thompson and Company. He turned. Isabelle stood in the doorway of his small office, arms crossed, studying him with that same quiet intensity she always had. I usually am, he said dryly. A flicker of amusement crossed her face before disappearing. We'll be pulling back our negotiations with them. The risk is too high. Robert nodded, sliding his laptop into his bag. Good call. She hesitated, just for a second. Then, she spoke again. You still have the instincts. But instincts without discipline are what got you here in the first place. He stiffened slightly. And what do you think I'm doing now? She held his gaze. That's what I'm waiting to see. She left before he could respond, her footsteps fading down the hall. Robert sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. She wasn't giving him an easy way out. She wasn't handing him back his power. But she had just admitted he still had value, and that meant he had a chance. Robert sat in his office long after the last employees had filtered out for the evening, staring at the city lights stretching beyond the glass windows. The hum of the building had quieted, the once bustling hallways now empty, save for the occasional security guard making their rounds. This silence had once been comforting to him, a reminder that he was the last one standing, the one putting in the extra hours, the one who deserved his success. Now, it felt different. Now, it felt like he was the only one who still had something to prove. The meeting earlier had been a turning point. For the first time since stepping into more enterprises, his words had carried weight. His insights had made a difference. Isabelle had acknowledged it, even if briefly, and the others had listened. It should have felt like a victory. It should have reignited the fire in him, the same fire that had driven him to build his empire from the ground up. But instead, it left him with an unsettling feeling in his chest. Because deep down he knew, this wasn't just about proving himself as a businessman. This was about proving himself to her. He had spent so much time focusing on his downfall, on the humiliation of his situation, that he had avoided the real truth. He hadn't just lost a company. He had lost the one person who had believed in him long before anyone else did. The one person who had stood by him when he had nothing and asked for nothing in return. And now, when he finally had the chance to speak to her, to be in the same room with her again, all she saw was a man trying to climb his way back. She didn't see regret. She didn't see change. Because he hadn't shown her any reason to. Robert exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair before standing up. He wasn't sure what he was doing, only that he couldn't sit in this office another second. His feet carried him down the hallway, toward the only office with a light still glowing behind the glass walls. Isabelle. He hesitated outside her door, debating whether to turn back. But he had never been a man who walked away from a difficult conversation. He knocked once before stepping inside. She glanced up from her desk, not surprised to see him. "It's late." Robert shut the door behind him, his throat tight. "I need to talk to you." She set her pen down, leaning back slightly. "About what?" He exhaled, gripping the back of the chair across from her. "About us." Something flickered in her expression, but it was gone before he could place it. "There is no us, Robert. There hasn't been for a long time." "I know," he admitted. "And that's my fault." She raised an eyebrow, tilting her head slightly. "Is this your way of asking for sympathy?" "No," he shook his head. "I don't deserve that. But I do owe you something I should have said a long time ago." She didn't speak, waiting. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet her gaze. "I'm sorry." The words felt foreign, heavier than he expected. He had said apologies before, but never like this. Never with this much weight behind them. Isabelle's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes shifted. "For what?" she asked softly. Robert exhaled slowly. "For taking you for granted. For making you feel like you were never enough when, in reality, you were too much for me to handle. For leaving you behind because I thought I needed something flashier. And for never once realizing that you were the reason I had any of it in the first place." The silence between them stretched, the hum of the city below filling the space where words failed. Isabelle's fingers traced the edge of a folder on her desk, her expression unreadable. "You're not saying this because you need this job?" she asked finally, her voice unreadable. Robert shook his head. "No, I'm saying this because, for the first time, I see it." She studied him for a long moment before standing, moving toward the window, her back to him. "Do you remember the last thing I said to you before you left?" He did. "You think you're making the right choice, Robert. I hope, one day, you won't regret it." His throat tightened. "Yeah." She nodded slightly, as if confirming something to herself. "Did you?" He didn't need to ask what she meant. Did he regret it? He thought about the years after their divorce. The parties, the wealth, the thrill of having someone younger, more exciting on his arm. The way it all had come crashing down, piece by piece, until he was left standing in the ruins of his own choices. And he thought about Isabelle, how she had walked away with nothing but had somehow built everything. How she had become the woman he should have known she was all along. "Yes," he said quietly. "I regret it." Isabelle didn't turn around. Good. The single word was softer than he expected, yet it carried more weight than anything else she had said that night. He swallowed. "Does that mean anything?" She finally turned, her brown eyes searching his, measuring him in a way that made his chest tighten. "I don't know yet," she admitted. Regret isn't the same as change. Robert held her gaze, understanding what she meant. Words were easy. Promises were easier. She wasn't interested in either. She needed proof. And for the first time in his life, Robert realized he wanted to give it to her. Not because he wanted his old life back. Not because he wanted control again. But because he wanted to be the man he should have been from the start. He nodded slowly. Then I guess I have work to do. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Isabelle's lips before she returned to her desk, picking up her pen once more. Yes, she said, glancing at the papers in front of her. You do. Robert turned, leaving her office with a new weight on his shoulders. But this time, it wasn't guilt. This time, it was determination. Robert threw himself into his work with a focus he hadn't felt in years. Every morning, he was in the office before anyone else, poring over reports, refining strategies, anticipating market shifts before they happened. He no longer operated as a man grasping at redemption, desperate to regain what he had lost. He worked as a man who had finally accepted that success wasn't just about power or recognition. It was about consistency, about proving himself through actions rather than words. At first, the employees at more enterprises were skeptical. They had watched his fall from grace unfold in real time, had whispered behind closed doors when he first walked through those glass doors as just another employee. Some still smirked when he passed, as if waiting for him to fail, expecting the arrogance that had once defined him to resurface. But Robert didn't give them that satisfaction. He didn't push back when assigned tasks beneath his former stature. He didn't challenge decisions in meetings where he wasn't the one in control. He listened. He learned. He took notes, absorbed information, and executed his responsibilities with precision. And slowly, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, things began to shift. It started with the smallest of acknowledgments. A nod from an executive who had once dismissed him outright. A brief glance from a junior analyst when one of his suggestions in a strategy session proved accurate. A project manager who began including him in discussions rather than simply assigning him tasks. They weren't monumental changes, but they were changes nonetheless. But the real test came when a crisis hit. It was a Friday afternoon when the first warning signs appeared. An unexpected dip in stock value, a sudden shift in investor sentiment following an industry report that painted a bleak picture for the financial sector. By Monday morning, the office was in chaos. Calls were coming in from board members demanding immediate reassurances. Analysts scrambled to assess the damage. The senior executives gathered in the main conference room, debating how to control the narrative before it spiraled further. Robert watched from his desk, fingers steepled as he listened to the tense conversations happening around him. The mistakes they were making were obvious. They were reacting rather than anticipating, moving to defend rather than getting ahead of the situation. He had been in this position before. He had navigated these waters. And for the first time since stepping foot in more enterprises, he felt the pull of his instincts, the certainty that he could fix this. But it wasn't his place to speak. Not yet. Instead, he sent an email. Direct, concise, requesting permission to present an alternative strategy for handling the crisis. He didn't demand to be heard. He didn't assume authority. He asked. Less than 10 minutes later, a response came. Isabelle, Moore has scheduled a meeting. Attendance mandatory. The conference room was full when he stepped inside. The air was thick with tension, discussions still echoing from conversations cut short the moment he entered. Isabelle sat at the head of the table, composed, the image of a leader who did not bend under pressure. She gestured for him to speak. Robert didn't hesitate. He moved to the front of the room, clicked the screen to display his presentation, and began. He walked them through the problem first, breaking down the market indicators, explaining why the current approach would only feed into investor panic rather than ease it. He outlined how more enterprises had positioned itself strategically, how they could use this moment to reinforce confidence rather than scramble to restore it. His voice was measured, his explanations clear, his reasoning airtight. He wasn't just offering solutions. He was proving that he belonged. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, executives exchanged glances. Some nodded. Others murmured in agreement. Even the skeptics, the ones who had been waiting for him to fall flat, couldn't argue against the logic of what he had presented. And then, finally, Isabelle spoke. We moved forward with Robert's plan. Just like that. No hesitation. No debate. Robert exhaled slowly, nodding. I'll oversee execution personally. She held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary, then nodded in return. The meeting ended, executives filing out, phones already in hand as they moved to implement the revised strategy. Robert lingered behind, watching as Isabelle gathered her papers, sliding them neatly into a folder. You could have waited for someone else to suggest it, she said without looking up. He tilted his head. But then it wouldn't have been mine to take responsibility for. A flicker of something, approval, perhaps, crossed her face before she tucked the folder under her arm and walked past him. For the first time, Robert didn't feel like a man grasping at the remnants of his past. He felt like a man stepping into something new. Você diz, ok. Lembra de desenvolver bem o capítulo, pois quero a mínimo de 7,000 characters, e a máximo de 8,000 characters, por capítulo. Sempre que eu falar ok. Faca o próximo capítulo / direcionamento, sem enviar mensagens intermediárias. Vai descrever subtítulos durante os capítulos. Apenas numera e nome o capítulo. Você pode juntar algumas frases lado a lado para que consiga alcançar o número de palavras mínimo. Não use frases ou palavras em negrito, itálico ou sublinhado, o ChatGPT diz. 12. The final decision, the weeks following the successful implementation of his strategy, had been a whirlwind. Robert was now fully immersed in the workings of Moore Enterprises. He had earned the respect of some of his colleagues, and his reputation, while still fragile, was beginning to rebuild itself. The company was weathering the storm, with the stock price slowly rising back up, investor confidence solidifying, and the media no longer writing headlines about failure, but instead focusing on the stability that Moore Enterprises had regained under Isabelle's leadership. But even as things started to fall into place, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that he was still missing something. There were moments when he stood in meetings, surrounded by people who were beginning to trust him again, but he felt like an outsider, like a shadow of the man he used to be. He had earned his place back, but Isabelle had never fully treated him as one of her equals. She wasn't dismissive of him, but she never sought his input unless it was absolutely necessary, never gave him the chance to prove himself beyond the confines of his role. She had placed him back in the system, but she had never given him the power to truly rise again. He knew why. Isabelle had done what he once believed was impossible. She had built something more substantial without him. She had proven that her leadership was capable of steering the company into the future, even after all the years he had dominated its direction. She was no longer just his ex-wife. She was now the CEO of the company, the face of Moore Enterprises, and he, despite everything he had done to earn back his place, was still nothing more than an employee. And that hurt more than he cared to admit. It was late one evening when Isabelle called him into her office. The company had just signed another major acquisition deal, and everything seemed to be going smoothly, but there was something in her voice, a subtle urgency, that piqued his curiosity. As he entered her office, he found her standing by the window. The skyline of the city stretched out before her, just as it had been on that first day he had walked into Moore Enterprises. This time, though, there was no air of triumph around her, no gleam in her eyes that suggested she had everything under control. There was a weariness to her now, a quiet kind of exhaustion that made her seem less like the woman he had known at her best, and more like a person carrying the weight of 1,000 decisions on her shoulders. "Sit down, Robert," Isabelle said, her voice calm but firm. He obeyed without hesitation, sitting across from her desk. There was no tension between them now, not in the way there had been in the past. It wasn't hostility, nor was it any of the affection he had once felt for her. It was simply an understanding that neither of them had fully acknowledged until this moment. "I need you to do something for me," Isabelle said. Her eyes didn't meet his as she continued to gaze out at the city, her fingers resting lightly on the surface of the desk. Robert raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" She turned to face him then, her gaze sharp, as if she had already made her decision. "I've been thinking about the direction of Moore Enterprises. We've done well with the acquisitions and the new strategies, but there's a gap. We're not as agile as we could be. I need someone I can trust to take on more responsibility, someone who can guide the company into new markets, someone who knows how to handle risk. And I think you're the only person who can do it." Robert blinked, processing her words slowly. "Are you asking me to?" "Yes," Isabelle interrupted. I'm offering you the position of Chief Strategy Officer. You'll be working directly with me, taking on more of the decision-making power. You'll have a seat at the table again, Robert." The words landed like a punch. He had never imagined she would offer him this. After all that had happened, after everything that had gone wrong, he had never expected Isabelle to trust him enough to give him control again. But now that the opportunity was on the table, it felt different. The position she was offering him was powerful, but it also came with a price. He would be working under Isabelle, answering to her as he had done before. But this time, the stakes were higher. This wasn't just about rebuilding his career. This was about proving to himself that he could rise again, not just as a man who had lost everything, but as someone who could change the course of a company, as someone who could make decisions with lasting impact. His mind raced, the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had wanted this, hadn't he? This was the chance to redeem himself fully. But was he willing to accept it under these circumstances? Was he willing to step back into a role that would never make him the ultimate decision-maker, that would forever place him beneath Isabelle in the hierarchy of power? He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Isabelle watched him carefully, her expression unreadable. "I know it's a lot to ask, especially after everything we've been through. But this is the best I can offer. The company needs leadership, and it needs someone who isn't afraid to take risks. I'm asking you to be that person, Robert. But if you can't commit, I need to know now." The silence stretched between them, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. Robert had spent so long chasing power, chasing control, but now, in this moment, he understood that those things were fleeting. What truly mattered was influence, real influence. Not in the way he had used to grasp for it, but in the way he could work alongside Isabelle, guiding the company with respect and collaboration. "I'll take it," he said finally, his voice steady, though his heart raced in his chest. "But only if you trust me." Isabelle nodded, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I do. I wouldn't have offered it to you if I didn't." For the first time in a long while, Robert felt like he was standing at the edge of something new. This wasn't the return to power he had once imagined. It wasn't the grand comeback he had fantasized about. But it was something real, something earned, not given, something that would require everything he had left, and that was exactly what he wanted. He stood up, straightening his suit. "Then I guess we have work to do." Isabelle's eyes met his. "Yes, we do." As he left her office, the weight of his decision didn't feel as heavy anymore. For the first time, he wasn't just trying to recover what he had lost. He was moving forward, stepping into a new role, one that didn't require him to be the loudest in the room, but to be the person who understood how to lead quietly, confidently, with respect for those around him. And in that, Robert finally realized, was where true power lay, and he was ready for it.